So the first thing is roll call.
Director Navarez. Director Gasca.
Present.
Director McNairland.
Present.
Director White.
Present.
Director Crane.
Present.
Chair McGorty.
Present. Okay, so next on the agenda is the approval of agenda.
I move to approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
It's been moved and seconded. Roll call, please.
Director Gasca.
Present?
Yes.
Yes, sorry.
Director McNairland.
Yes.
Director White.
Yes.
Director Crane.
Aye.
Chair McGorty.
Yes.
And I missed who seconded.
Is it Director Crane? Did you second the motion? No. Oh, Director White did, sorry. Okay, motion carries. Next, we have public comment on items not on the agenda. This time is reserved for the public to address the board about matters not on the agenda and within the jurisdiction of the board. Persons wishing to speak on specific agenda items should do so at times specific for those items. Is there anybody in the chambers? No, there is not. Is there anybody online who wishes to address the board? Barring none, we will move on to the next item. I don't know that I have a complete list. Hold on. Okay, great. All right, so not seeing anyone wanting to make a comment, we'll move on to staff updates.
And with that, I would like to introduce the GSA's legal counsel, Holly Roberson, who will be presenting a brief presentation on the Brown Act and changes to the Brown Act and the repeal of the state of emergency.
Hi, everybody. Congratulations for living through the pandemic. It's now officially over because the state of emergency has been officially listed. However, my own mother currently has COVID, so I encourage you all to continue to be safe. It's good to be with you here today. So I'm going to keep this very short because we have a packed agenda today and you have a detailed PowerPoint in your board packet, so I'm not going to redo the PowerPoint. You all know you need to come in person because you are here in person. The governor rescinded AB 361. Well, he rescinded the executive order, and that means that AB 361, which allowed remote meetings during the emergency, that's now expired. So therefore, starting March 1st, board meetings have to be back regular Brown Act order. However, there are a couple of options that I want to make sure you know about. Board members can still participate virtually. However, it's under very limited circumstances now. So there's a new law, AB 2449, which says that a board member can participate virtually if there's articulated just cause or an emergency basis for virtual participation. And you also have to limit the frequency of virtual participation. So in plain English, what that means is you're going to need to provide a reason if you're not coming, such as medical reason or care for an immediate family member. Section 54953F allows you to do that. However, just cause could also be a contagious illness, a need related to a disability. You do not have to disclose the disability. Or if you're traveling on official business of a legislative body or another state or local agency, that may be important for some of you. I know you all wear a lot of hats, excuse me, in the community. There are specific requirements for notification if you're going to need to participate remotely. And I think most importantly, you need to keep it to less than 20% of our meetings or 2 times per year. And since we only meet quarterly, that would be once or twice at the most. So again, it's from now on, just plan, please, to meet in person. If you do have an emergency, you can ask questions of me, you can ask questions of Eric, you can reference this PowerPoint, and there are some limited exceptions where we can still have you participating virtually if needed on a rare basis. This does not apply to staff, so Eric and I, we have the luxury of not being as important as you, so we can still participate virtually if you want us to, which can also help save the GSA time and money. So, any questions? Doug?
I believe we could also use our agency's counsel for that sort of question.
Sure. I mean, it's the same law for everybody,
Right.
Brown Act. Your counsel might prefer that if you have questions related to the GSA, you ask me just in case they're busy, but I certainly don't mind. It's going to be, it ought to be the same answer
Should
either
be.
way. Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Any other questions? Great, thank you.
Very good. So I do have a question for staff. So you've handed me this paper. Is this our consent agenda? Or? Okay, got it. All right, that's item number 6. Thank you. All right, discussion and possible action items. Proposed revisions to the fiscal year 2023 budget. Staff, Eric?
Yes, thank you, Glenn. In recent times, because of certain changes that have occurred, one of them being the repeal of the state of emergency that's now causing the GSA to meet in person, there could be some cost implications there if there's a desire to have staff attending in person. But then also, we've been looking into the GSA's files and trying to understand where the GSA is at and where we need to go to be a fully functioning JPA. And there's been a couple of things that we've noted that have come up. And in addition to that, we also have the executive order, which is asking us to comply with some new rules around well permitting. And so GSA staff, along with legal counsel, has been focused on working with staff from the county and trying to work towards a solution for well permitting. And we had our first workshop in November. And from that, we learned a lot of great information from the agricultural stakeholders and the public. And so with that, we're now looking to continue moving along that process. And based on numerous factors, including those I just named here, and there's more detailed information in the staff report for agenda item 5A, I have a proposed revision to the fiscal year 2023 budget. One thing you will note about the fiscal year 2023 budget is that even though we're reallocating some funds to certain expenses, the net change is a positive change to the budget overall, whereas in the last budget we talked about, we had a account balance at the end of the year projected to be for $133,386. And with these revisions, even though there's some increase in the GSA administration budget, for example, there is going to be more money in our account at the end of the year in fiscal year 2023, which then sets us up for more flexibility in fiscal year 2024 and beyond. So those are the main points I wanted to cover for this revised budget. And one of the items I also wanted to point out here, which is also related to another agenda item that we'll discuss later on this meeting, is the grant writing and management item in the budget. So we had $35,000 to pursue the DWR grant funding that we pursued and applied for in December. And so we're asking for an additional $10,000 with that to pursue a possible grant opportunity that I'm still diving a little bit more into. But it may provide us the opportunity, depending if I get some clarification, that we could pursue a grant that will allow us to pursue other grants. So you're getting a grant to pursue other grants with that same money. So that could be a significant cost savings to the GSA. So that is one item that If that opportunity becomes a viable option, and we pursue that, that budget will go towards that. But if we don't pursue that, that additional 10,000 for that particular line item will not be touched, and we'll have an additional $10,000 accounted for at the end of the fiscal year. So with that, I will pause and bring it back to the board chair with any questions and anyone else on the board. Yes.
So thank you for the detailed staff report. Really easy to follow and understand, and I appreciate it. Thank you, especially regarding the budget. A lot of work was put into that. Thanks. The only one question I have on this is for the line item of board and TAC meetings. It shows it going up $13,000 due to in-person meetings. And since we only have 4 meetings, and a committee usually isn't that labor intensive for committee meetings, it said to see attachment 1. I went to attachment 1, and really it just showed that one line item as like $2,917 a month. So it didn't really explain why the cost went up $13,000. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell me how you arrived at that increase.
Yes. Thank you, Board Member McNairland, for that. So when it comes to the estimation here from $29,000 to $42,000, that was assuming that there would be a preference that the board would like the GSA staff to attend in person for the next 2 board meetings, including this one, and then potentially for future TAC meetings. However, that has not entirely been clear if GSA staff should only be present for 1 board meeting a year or 1 TAC meeting a year, or to be completely virtual in some respects. Just in general, Sabrina, who is our staff member, she will attend meetings in person to help facilitate the in-person aspect of this meeting like today. So it's really a question of, is it just Sabrina or myself who would attend? So that's accounting for those costs. And then also the other thing too is to keep note of is that the $29,000 was for 4 board and TAC meetings throughout the year. We had 2 special board meetings that occurred this year so far to address some urgent matters that came up. And so that sort of burnt that money a little bit faster for that. So that's why we're at the current expense of $28,991 right now. So $42,000 was mainly to give a comfortable conservative estimate in case we needed to be in person for multiple future meetings, including TAC meetings. But if we don't actually end up using that entire budget, then that will not be used, and then whatever's left over will carry over into the next year. So that's how we came to that number.
How often I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
may I? How often does TAC meet?
The TAC meets quarterly as well.
Quarterly as well?
Yeah.
Round table, typical committee meeting? I mean, it's not as formal as this?
No, and so that's the other thing is we also are assuming we would be using these chambers for those TAC meetings as well. And since they are board compliant, they would have to be in person and hybrid as well. And it's the TAC chair's preference to have it be, and the TAC committee as well, to have it be an in-person setting with hybrid capabilities. So that is why we're assuming that there could be extra support there.
We get charged for this room?
We only get charged $75 per meeting, is that correct? Yes, it's $75 per meeting. So it's very low cost
That
in
includes
general.
Scott? and
Yes, that
everything?
includes support from the county staff.
So it's not really the cost of this room, it's more your travel and,
Travel and other costs, and in preparation of materials and everything else that goes into that, yes. Yes, Director Crane.
If an advisory body, which is the TAC committee, meets, are they controlled by Brown?
I will direct that to our legal counsel.
Yes, your technical advisory committee needs to be compliant with the Brown Act because you have board members sitting on that committee.
If
So it's a
it's
regular
less
meeting.
than a majority?
Yeah, because it's acting through delegated authority because of the way it was set up. We actually wrote analysis of this. Eric, have you shared that analysis with the board?
I did share that with the TAC, in particular to the Brown Act compliance for the TAC, but I don't believe I shared it with the board as well in addition to the TAC.
Okay. Director Crane, we anticipated your question. We did the legal research. We strongly advise that you have your technical advisory committee be compliant with the Brown Act because of the way the technical advisory committee was set up. So it's acting in a quasi.
Is that because of a revision that in Brown, or is that the way it's been all along?
It's been that way as long as I've been practicing the Brown Act. It may not have been that way a long time ago.
I was under the impression that as long as it wasn't a majority of the body, then the technical didn't require Brown. So I live and learn. Thank you.
Certainly. And there is legal analysis available, which, Eric, I would ask that you circulate so people can
Yes.
take a look at it. Thank you.
Director White?
Yeah, you said that because there were board members on it, that's what triggered the Brown Act requirement. There are no board members on
You don't have any board members on your technical advisory committee?
it. No, the only hitch was Adam was on it, and then he became the board member for here. But I don't believe that you're going to continue as board member to be on the TAC, are you?
I'm not sure yet. I don't think the Farm Bureau has chosen a replacement for me or an alternate. Because I was that we choose a member to be on the board and then an alternate, and then the alternate serves on the TAC. And so I started as the alternate, but I was also coming to these meetings just in case Zach didn't show up and to know what's happening. But I did attend the last TAC thinking I wasn't supposed to, but I wanted to go anyway.
Right.
And it was good that I did because they haven't chosen somebody to replace me as an alternate. And I don't know when that's going to happen.
And is it just you, or is there any other board member who's participating? Not just
As
you,
far
like
as-
diminutively,
Yeah.
but
As far as
So historically, the TAC has not been board members necessarily. So when it started, I was chair of the TAC, and I was a board member, but, well, I wasn't either because Carrie Brown was on the board at that time. So TAC typically has not been board members. It's been just people appointed.
Yeah, when it
Yeah.
was formed, this was going to be like elected people would be on this and staff would be on the TAC. And there wasn't supposed to be a mix there.
yeah. So the other partial reason would be the way that the TAC is operating in terms of how we use the TAC as a board and what sort of decisions or what sort of input they're giving. You know, so the question isn't clear, black and white, yes or no. It also has to do with how they're operating, right? And what kind of, are they operating as a quasi-judicial entity? So these facts are different than the facts I was given when I did the analysis. So my recommendation would be, let me go back, take another look at our analysis, and provide with the input that we have at most one board member actively participating in TAC. Is that right?
And that's not typical. This is just sort of temporary, we think.
Yeah, just as there was the transition from me being on the TAC to here.
Right. Welcome.
Just-
So yeah, I would suggest that let me take another look at it with new facts and see if that changes the analysis.
For my own clarification, when you say board member, you're referring specifically to this board,
Correct.
Yes,
not any elected?
that is correct.
Okay, thanks.
Voting member, this board. The president could sit on the TAC and it wouldn't really matter for that.
Counselor, I have another question for you too, as long as we're on kind of the issues of Brown Act compliant. Is staff required to be live, or can they be remote for our meetings?
Staff can be remote at any time. They're not subject to the Brown Act.
Okay, thank
Only
you.
people who vote.
Okay.
I just wanted to let the board know that my elected board, Ukiah Valley Sanitation District, our general manager is not a local. And so we have monthly meetings, and she is on Zoom on a laptop that we set at a table. And it seems we haven't had any issues with that so far. Because A, we want to save money for her and for her safety traveling, to our meetings. So I just wanted to give you that input.
Thank you.
And Glenn, if I may.
Go ahead.
So if anyone has any other further questions about the budget, or if you have suggested revisions, please, I'm open to hearing and talking about that further. But just to be clear, if we're under budget, and that money will carry over to the next year.
Great.
And that is the goal, is to
Nobody
try to be
sweeps
under.
it, in other words, like they do in other departments in
Yes,
the county. Right.
because I understand the financial constraints we have.
The only question on that budget, you were talking about it as it's influenced by whether you attend meetings in person or remotely. And we haven't discussed that as to what our preference is, but I know that from my standpoint, I found those Zoom meetings to be really functional. They were really easy to manage for me, more than this type of setting. We're required to be here, but I see no need for staff to have to come physically here. I would just as happily see them on the screen and save the money.
I agree.
Supervisor Crane.
I concur. I think that driving's not working.
I agree as well. I think it's just,
For you or for
it's easier.
staff?
All of the above.
So
All of the above.
I see you looking at me, and I just want to clarify that the budget is a little different for legal counsel travel versus West Yost travel. So if you have a preference for us to participate remotely, that's certainly fine. But my contract does not involve any charge for travel time for this.
I looked at you because you're a more pleasant face.
Ooh, let's not get personal here. All right, so,
No, the back of his head. That was,
Eric, I
That
told you
disarmed
should have
it.
sat over here with us.
I know, right?
Yeah.
okay. So, and I think that is good use of time for you. It's easier. There are times when it may be necessary to be here, and I think we can anticipate that. The first meeting is a good example because we're trying to familiarize ourselves with this, and we will need somebody to operate the Zoom meeting. That's kind of an issue. So, what we've done in the past with our consultants is we've had TAC meeting in the morning and a board meeting in the afternoon. That might be a good way of bringing you here, so then it's very efficient. I see Beth shaking her head.
So just to directly address your comment about having the TAC meeting and the board meeting on the same day, the challenge with that, and after much discussion with our TAC chair, Beth, is that it makes translating what was discussed in the TAC very difficult to be disseminated and thought through and then put together in a way that's then ready for the board to take in and then make tangible decisions with. If it's all on the same day, then there's no differentiation between what was discussed at the TAC and then what's discussed at the board level.
So you
that
like
is
separation.
so having that separation, especially a couple weeks of separation, is really helpful to making sure what's discussed at the TAC then comes to the board in the right form that can be actionable in the best way possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, are there any further discussions on this? Are we all done with the item A? Okay. Any public comment before we move on? Barring none, we'll move on to our next item, business.
We need to vote on this item.
Oh, proposed revision, we haven't done that yet. Okay. Is there a second for moving the recommended action?
I'll second it.
Crane
Okay.
moved the recommended action.
And second by Al White. Have a roll call vote, please.
Director Gasca,
Yes.
Director McNarland,
Yes.
Director White,
Yes.
Director Crane,
Aye.
Chair McGorty.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Chair,
Yes.
may I, just a point of parliamentary. Now that we're meeting in person, we're not required to do roll call for most items. You can just do an up or down vote if you wish.
We decided early on, before you were on the board, that we'd like roll call. So this way we have a record of who supported what. I agree with you, but we decided to be a little more formal. But good point of order. Thank you. Let's move on to item B, unless there's a question or comment. Councillor Holly, so.
Thank you. Just real quick, I noticed there's some people chatting in the chat, and so since we have a hybrid meeting, it might be useful for public comment. Just to clarify for the folks on Zoom, if they would like to make a public comment, does this board want to request that they raise their hand on Zoom so we know that they have a public comment they want to make versus just commenting on the chat generally?
I would prefer that they raise their hand,
Okay,
and I think we can bring them into the meeting.
great. Thank you very much.
All right, so let's go on to item 5B, which is the draft fiscal year 2024 budget. Oh, question for,
We don't see, or at least I'm not seeing on my screen, where a raised hand would be. If we don't see it, who would? And what would be the procedure for asking that person or having that person automatically make us aware of?
so if you click on the participants button, which is down on the bottom, the list should come up, and then usually we would have our staff watch, and they would bring attention to it when I say, is there any comments from the public online?
I have my participant list up on the screen, so if you look up, you can see.
Okay. All right, are we good on that? Now we're ready for item 5B, which is the draft fiscal year 2024 budget.
Thank you, Chair McGorty. I don't want to spend too much time on this. There's a lot of detail in here for the board members who have already are familiar with it. I crafted this fiscal year 2024 budget. This is just a draft. We're not voting on this at all. This is just to give you a glimpse of the possible scenarios that may occur.
Can you bring it up on screen?
Yes, I'll bring it up on the screen. There we go. Okay. One moment. Sabrina, could you move the participants? There we go. Okay.
Seeing it on my screen. So.
Do you see it on your screen? Okay, great. So there's several things that I want to point out. The first is that every GSA I think I've talked to so far in the state, a lot of GSAs are in a financial tough situation either next year in fiscal year 2024 or in fiscal year 2025. And one of the big reasons why we pursued that DWR grant was that from a cash flow perspective, that grant would alleviate a lot of the implementation costs to be removed from our typical member agency contributions that are funding the GSA and shift it to the grant, which then allows us much more flexibility moving forward into the future to be able to implement our GSP and then also have the flexibility to have more of our budget freed up to be flexible going forward. So I have a couple of different projections here. And so one of them is the, assuming there's no grant funding that we receive from DWR, And I projected it out a couple months, or a couple years going to fiscal year 2026. And basically in that scenario, we are in a okay situation in fiscal year 2024, but starting in fiscal year 2025, it becomes more difficult. And if we assume certain costs that are sort of constant with administration and other implementation costs being monitoring and others, we're in a tight situation, and we would require additional funds to keep the GSA functional. That doesn't mean we wouldn't necessarily make some changes to try to free up as much cash as we can, but basically without grant funding and even with additional cash contributions, things are tight. And then so this is the baseline budget, and you could see that in fiscal year 2024, we're doing okay. But as soon as we go to this more detailed budget, it's a little bit of a small screen, so let me zoom in here. We start running into issues within August of 2024, August of 2023. Sorry, this table has a typo here. But we start running into issues starting in August in terms of cash flow. We get really tight. And then if you bring in extra cash from the GSAs in November, it does provide us some flexibility, and we have a lot more flexibility moving forward. So that the scenario without grant funding is difficult. I don't want to sugarcoat it at all. But if we go to the DWR grant, if we get that funding, our situation is a lot more flexible. So we do have a little bit of a tight pinch in November of 2023, where the cash flow is a little bit tight. But if we do get the grant funds and we do get additional funds from the GSA member agencies, a smaller amount compared to the scenarios without the grant funding, the GSA is really set up to be in a very strong financial position moving forward. And so these are just some of the scenarios that I wanted to bring to the board for consideration. So then that way you have this information, you can go back to your respective boards to start that discussion and at least bring it to their attention that we're thinking ahead, we have a couple of scenarios involved, and that when we meet again in the future in June and we approve a fiscal year 2024 budget, we can bring back those feedback from the board members, from your respective boards, and then we can finalize the budget in the way we need to for moving forward in 2024, but then also have a more clear understanding of what additional support we may be able to get if needed, and what each GSA is able to do if needed in those scenarios. So with that, I am gonna stop there and then pause and bring it back to the board for further discussion.
Here we go. Sorry about that. I lost my button momentarily for the sound. So are there any board member questions or comments on the budget as shown? Teresa, you want to go first?
Okay. The grants that you're referring to, just because I'm learning curve, have those already been applied for and we're waiting to see if we receive those?
Yes, we've already applied for that DWR grant, and we are expecting preliminary award notice if we got funds or not in as early as June, but just knowing the pace of which DWR sometimes can move, it could be a little bit later than that, maybe in August, but June would be the earliest. Right around the time we would be considering the next year's budget and approving it.
Al?
Okay. At an earlier meeting, this is too weird.
Oh, you gotta mute your Zoom and do the other one. I can actually probably do it for you. Try now?
The button that used to be
Oh,
over
I just
here.
did it for you.
Oh, I'm alive. Thank you. Yeah, so at an earlier meeting on the budget question, you had talked about our agencies possibly putting more money in earlier with the idea that it would be less later and the total amount wasn't going to be changed from what we were anticipating. Is that still the case?
Yes, so in these scenarios, I am assuming that whatever is upfront given in additional contributions in earlier time, that you will pay less on the back end in fiscal year 2026, assuming that all those conditions are fine, which I'm assuming will be the scenario. And that in the end, the total contributions from fiscal year 2023 to fiscal year 2026 would be the same amount. It's just you're putting a little bit more now to then not pay as much later. So that is that's assumed in these spreadsheet models, yes.
Other questions, comments? Director Karen?
A remark. The downside of that is the cost of things could run away from the budget, in which case it's probably not wise for us to imply that there will be a surplus.
Yeah, I think it benefits us to be very conservative in our projections. So.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments from board members? Questions or comments on anyone online? Does anybody have their hand raised?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, so you said we don't need to take a vote on this? This is
No, this is
informational?
just simply an informational item, so that way you have the information you need to communicate back to your boards and then be prepared for the next board meeting to discuss it further.
Okay, very good. All right, so where are we on the agenda? So we're on
5C.
item 6,
Yep.
consent agenda?
Oh, 5C.
5C, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Oh, I see, we have to flip it over. Here we are, okay. So item C is amendment to Larry Walker Associates GSA on-call contract.
Thank you, Chair McGordy. So it came to my attention not too long ago that the stream gauges that were installed have been either damaged or they're offline, and so our consultant being Laurel Marcus and the California Land Stewardship Institute, who is contracted with the GSA to do stream flow monitoring for the GSA throughout fiscal year 2023, has not been able to take measurements, even during these recent storms with all the rain. So I talked to Larry Walker and Laura and her group, and I talked to them about what would it take to get that prepared and updated. And right now, with the budget they have, they do not have enough funds to do the annual report, attend meetings, and to support some of the database updates. And so this contract amendment is to provide them the additional funds they need to repair the stream gauges, so that we can do those measurements this year before the end of the year. And then, so that is the only cost that's being added to this. And then also, just to be clear, this has already been accounted for in the revised 2023 budget that was approved not too long ago at this meeting. So that's already accounted in the budget, and there's no change to that.
Questions or comments from board members?
Move the recommended action.
Your button disappeared.
My
huh?
button disappeared.
Okay. Okay, so it's been moved by Director Crane and seconded by Director White to recommended action of approving the contract, amended contract. Roll call vote, please.
Director Gasca? Aye. Director McNairland?
Yes.
Director White? Yes. Director Crane?
Aye.
Chair McGordy?
Yes.
Motion passes.
All right, on to item 5D, which is GSA Policy Updates.
Thank you, Chairman Gordy. So part of the process that the GSA staff has been doing has been looking at our current policies and procedures on things. And one of the things that became very apparent in recent months has been that since GSA staff, being West Coast, myself, and Sabrina and others, have stepped into this role to administer the GSA, we have found that the existing bylaws and the forms associated with procurement and exception to bid and other items are inconsistent with how we can do our business effectively, because it would still require us to be involving county staff in a way that's no longer appropriate. And so there's several resolutions that were brought forward. Another one that's related to this as well is that the current GSA policy on how do we respond to requests in situations that require time-sensitive business decisions and actions that need to be taken place in between board meetings, since we meet quarterly, has not been clear. And then another one, in addition to that, is reviewing our procurement process and changing it in a few ways to make it so it gives the GSA more flexibility to do contracting in a way that's going to make it more streamlined for us going forward and simpler. So there's 3 resolutions, all associated with this for this agenda item. And I will now pass it back to the board to discuss these particular resolutions. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer anything.
So why don't we bring up the resolution 23-01 and then you can just kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of what's going on with it so that we're fresh in our memory.
Okay. So Resolution 2301 essentially provides a framework in clear language around how policy decisions can be taken into account when there's urgent matters. And so it clearly states that any decisions regarding GSA governance shall be brought to the full board or at a regular, special, or emergency meeting unless the urgency of a particular matter necessitates action more quickly needs to be taken, but in accordance with the Brown Act. And so if there's an urgent matter that comes up, GSA staff would then attempt to contact the chair and vice chair to confer on the urgent matter and seek guidance on how to proceed, whether it needs to be waited to go to a full board decision, or if it can be something that we can act upon within our legal confines of being able to do, and then we can bring it at a later time to update the board on what occurred, and then allowing that to still basically take place. And so this just provides a framework and clear language around how we would go about addressing urgent actions that may need to be required in between board meetings.
Okay, board members, any comments or question on this item?
Yeah, I'm a little unclear. Action taken in discussion with the chair and vice chair in an emergency situation, is that subject to ratification, or is that just like those 2 members can make any decision that was?
It would still need to be ratified
Okay,
at a future board meeting, yes.
so it'd be like an interim
Yes,
step or something?
yes.
Okay. I'm okay with
And it actually clarifies on item 3 that any decisions made pursuant to this policy shall be brought to the board at the next meeting for ratification.
that. I see.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? All right. Are there any questions or comments from people online? Doesn't look like it. Okay, so let's go on to the next policy.
Thank you. So the next policy is related to providing letters of support for member agencies and other entities seeking GSA support for projects and grants. So there was a policy that was discussed and brought to the board at the October 21, 2021 meeting. But I did not find any, what's the word for it? I didn't find any documentation on it was actually ratified and fully adopted and signed by the board as effective that meeting. So it seems that we may have not had an actual policy around this. And so we drafted one up, and essentially the big things here is that if a letter of support is being requested from the GSA to do a project or to pursue a grant that is related to the sustainable groundwater management within the basin, then that needs to have more discussion amongst the board, and it needs to be absolutely ratified at a later board meeting if anything moves forward on that. And then if it's for a project or a grant that is unrelated to sustainable groundwater management within the basin, and it's not within the direct purview of the GSA in what we have a focus on, then we have a little bit more flexibility there. But the language in here just, again, provides more clarity on how that process would go and what would happen. But either way, it will always come back to the board to be ratified at a later time.
So here's a question for you on that. So if we do have another agency that's looking to pursue a grant that doesn't necessarily involve us, but involves groundwater, they can certainly pursue the grant. We just can't, write a letter without the board approving, correct?
That is sort of it depends. I think it depends on the scale of like how this could be impacting groundwater, for example. Like let's say someone wants to put in a well and it's going to be used as an emergency supply source, then that is something that, impacts our groundwater and the management of that potentially. But that's why part of this process is that I would reach out to the chair and the vice chair to discuss this further, and then we would determine how we would go about providing this letter of support, and that either way, it will always come back to the board to be ratified at a future meeting and for further discussion. So we don't want to necessarily be a bottleneck to those being able to get letter support when they need it, but we don't want it to be done in a vacuum and it doesn't get back to the board at the end. It needs to come back to the board at the end regardless. That's the purpose.
So I'm thinking about municipal water supplies. They're exempt from, for instance, our emergency order right now.
Yes.
So they can do pretty much what they want, correct, as far as putting in wells and having any studies associated with it?
Yes. Yeah, so either way, we could provide a letter of support, but we would want to bring it back to the board for discussion and say, yes, this is what the request was. We provide a letter of support, and then the board ratifies it, just to confirm that that letter was provided.
Okay, and then if the board didn't like it, they don't necessarily have to ratify it?
Yes.
Okay, I want to be sure that I understand this completely. I hope we never in that situation, but
But it's still gone out already, right?
yeah.
The letter.
Yeah.
So,
Question.
okay. Director Crane.
Is it appropriate to develop more of a standard response or a set of responses for particular types of questions that sort of clarify how far individuals or less than the entire body
For example,
decide?
can you articulate a little bit what you're thinking?
Well, we've had discussions in past with Eric on this topic. The idea being, is it an emergency? What sort of an emergency that warrants this sort of action?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, if it's, let's say, an example, perhaps not a good one, but an example that comes to mind, there's a care facility, and they need an emergency well in order to sustain their operation. Is that the sort of thing that the group is confident in the officers to approve, or the manager to approve?
Yeah.
Where's the line, general terms, between what needs to come back to the board, to the body, rather than have it be expedited.
Yeah, that's a great example, actually. So in that type of example, I would say that it should be appropriate for the board to trust in the officers and myself to make a decision and move forward on providing that letter of support, and then just simply informing you at the next meeting and then ratifying it that way anyway. When it comes to, let's say there's a project that comes up where someone wants to put in a giant well field, right? And it's an agricultural entity or it's some other type of thing that it would significantly impact the management of the basin in terms of the GSA's purview of trying to achieve the sustainability goal. And it's clearly obvious that there's some conflict in that. That is something that we would want to take pause and think through and be diligent about making a decision that is going to benefit us to make sure we achieve our goal, and it's not taking us away from achieving that goal, and it's actually being a negative in the future type of situation. So that's like the clear line of distinction, I think, is if it's something that's clearly going to impinge upon our ability to meet a sustainability goal, and it's obvious, versus something that is, like in that example, it's an emergency well. Obviously, that warrants our attention and our support because there's a human health aspect to that, right? And it's something a little bit beyond sustainably managing the groundwater basin as a whole.
Okay. So, Councilor Robeson, again, going to our emergency Brown Act meeting rules, how many hours notice do we need for that?
An emergency meeting is 24 hours.
So I think it's a pretty rare occasion where that wouldn't work as well. If we really were concerned, we could bring in the whole board for a decision, which would be kind of my inclination, not to take it on me and the vice chair and our executive director. So.
Could I make a suggestion?
Sure.
So we've come up with this resolution because you don't have a policy, right? And we're trying to help you have more standard processes as we become more grown up as an agency. Emergency Brown Act meetings, as you know, are really supposed to be for emergency purposes. And so I might suggest that if you think this is going to be something that could come up regularly and we know about it, rather than manage it as through the emergency meeting process, to just consider developing a policy. And the policy perhaps could be something like you have a subcommittee where, because ultimately you need to know and trust each other's judgment, right?
Correct.
I mean, that's what we're trying to get at here. So if you can get to a place where you know and trust each other's judgment enough to have a delegated, call it your letter of support committee or whatever, then it could go through that process and you'd have a policy and you wouldn't be handling it through regular emergency meetings.
Yeah, I kind of see it. It was really clear to me for something like a health and safety issues, and it becomes a little bit vaguer when we start talking about someone needing to put a well in immediately because who knows what, maybe their well failed or whatever.
Yeah, certainly. Real emergencies, that's why that provision is there.
I feel comfortable with the chair and the vice chair and the staff being able to make the decision whether it's just a standard letter of support that doesn't raise a lot of concerns, or if it's something concerning that should come to the whole board, or if it does need an emergency meeting. So I'm more comfortable establishing a policy for that because I do trust the members on this board and the staff that they have the expertise in this area.
Yeah, I'm just looking for boundaries.
I am as well, because what we don't want to do is have a situation where board members really get upset with each other and create internal strife. And if there's a policy that we can set to avoid that, it's a good idea to do it up front. Director White?
Well, I can't see the rest of this because only half of it's on the screen, but my understanding is that this is really just about letters of support, not about spending money or committing us to doing anything. So I think it's a minor issue, and I support what
I support the idea of this, but I think that in future we should work on something about a little more refinement of the boundaries.
Okay. Adam, any thoughts before we go to the
I think
public?
it's good. I mean, I trust the chair and vice chair. I don't, like in the case of an emergency well, I mean, I don't know how fast, I mean, how long can people go without water? And how fast are you really gonna get somebody to come drill? And, I mean, it really comes down to if it is that big of an emergency, I don't, like, it's gonna be bigger than our board anyway. And if it's, I can think of like if there's a grant proposal, someone realized and they had really short notice and it was on some kind of conservation program, it's kind of a no-brainer. The chair, vice chair should just sign the letter of support because its impact is going to be positive to our management of the basin. You know, pretty much anything negative is going to be using more water, and you're not going to drill a well that quickly. So I don't really see that many times where the issue would come up. So, I mean, I think this is good enough for now, and we can, you know, throw some rocks at it and see if there is scenarios where we would want to fine tune it, like Doug is saying.
And the genesis of this was, if we're meeting on a quarterly basis, how do we get out of the way over something that we don't actually control anyway?
Yeah.
Because we're not granting the permission or approval for the drilling of a well, for instance. But because of the regulation, we're involved in providing approval or disapproval.
Just to clarify, that's a separate matter, and that's a related executive order. This is just letters of support for a project or
Understood.
a grant, yeah.
But that other discussion was the root of this one, I believe. This evolved out of that, is my sense of it.
Okay.
Yes, in some ways, yes.
Al?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see it the same way you do. I see this as totally focused on letters of support, and the issues that you were talking about is centered around the whole governor's thing that we have to do, proving things. I forget what you call it, but you know what we're talking about. So I think they're not.
Enough separation.
Okay, so we'll see if there's any online comments before we move on to the next item.
So just point of clarification, is the board directing staff and council to develop a policy based on the resolution? Or does the board want to try the resolution, see how it works, and then we'll do a policy if we need it?
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I think that's the case.
Okay.
We'll get to vote on all three of them at the end, or do you want us to vote on them as we go? What's the problem?
It's your discretion. Typically, you would vote one by one as you go.
In the agenda, I have it as voting all three at once, just to be clear.
Oh,
But we can revise that, of course. If
yeah, it would be great if we vote on each one separately, but it's at the discretion of the chair if you want to have all the votes at the end or as we go.
concur.
You would
Take
rather
them-
do each
take
one
them
individually?
One at a time and vote on
Okay.
them one at a time.
All right, so at this point, what do you want to do? Do you want to consider this one for a vote and go back and catch the other one and then move on to the third one?
I move to approve Resolution 2301.
Second.
Okay, any further board discussion? If not, we'll call for the question. So it's been moved and seconded to approve Resolution 2301.
Director Gasca,
Aye.
Director McNearland,
Aye.
Director White,
Aye.
Director Crane,
Aye.
Chairman Gordy.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, now we'll consider Resolution 2302. Do I hear a motion to approve?
Move the recommended action.
I'll second it.
Okay, been moved and seconded to approve Resolution 2302. Roll call, please.
Director Gasca,
Aye.
Director McNearland,
Aye.
Director White,
Aye.
Director Crane,
Aye.
Chairman Gordy.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, now we can go on to,
And there's a third one, too.
what's that?
There's a third resolution.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. 2303. do you want to go ahead and share that with us? And
Yes. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. So Resolution 2303, sorry, is really straightforward. It basically takes the county's procurement policy and provide a little bit more clarity behind it, and then it also changes one particular aspect of it. Before, there was a limitation of $25,000 for doing an on-call contract if we choose to do so. $25,000, as you may imagine, is extremely limiting, and it makes it nearly impossible to do much with that in a productive manner. So this policy is basically, it keeps everything the same, public projects are the same, everything is up to date and consistent with the current laws and regulations for procurement. The one thing is it provides the cap from $25,000 for sole sourcing contracts to $50,000 for professional services. So that is the major difference that we clarify. And then we also provide a little bit more language around contract amendments and how they will be handled. And if we do so in the future, it'll be an exemption to competitive bid form be completed if you want to amend a contract. That was originally a on-call contract from less than $50,000. Yes.
Director Crane, or
Uniform cost accounting, does this particular item, is it affected by those state standards, or because this is professional services, it's not?
I drafted this to be consistent with the uniform code.
Yeah.
So this is consistent with the uniform code, and it does apply there too?
Yes. Yeah, and the numbers have been updated because the legislation was updated to have higher numbers.
The amount has changed over the years.
Correct.
5,000, I think, was the limit when I got started in this silliness.
you date yourself.
No comment.
And so part 4 of the resolution goes into the uniform code, and it was updated, as Holly said.
All right, I move the recommended action.
Okay, so it's been moved by Director Crane and seconded by Director White for the recommended action. Is there any further board comment?
Public?
Any public comment? Barring none, I think we can call for the vote.
Director Gaska?
Aye.
Director McNearland?
Aye.
Director White? Director Crane?
Aye.
Chair McGorty?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Great. Now we'll move on to item E, which is the water year 2022 annual report results.
With that, I would like to, Audra, are you going to be taking the lead on this? Wonderful. I would like to introduce Audra Bardsley from Larry Walker Associates. Her and Laura worked very hard on the annual report, and they're here to present the results of that report. And I'll let them take it away and share their screen.
Good afternoon to both of you.
Thank you, Glenn. And I just want to give the floor to Audra. She's the one who really did the hard work. So I really want her to be able to present what we came up with in front of you. Audra is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, board members, for allowing us to take your time today to share with you some of the major highlights that we came up with in completing the water year 2022 annual report for the Ukiah Valley GSA. All right, so let me go ahead and I will share my screen here. Okay, let me just find. Okay. All right, excuse me.
Is it letting you share your screen?
You know what? Now I have just gotten it. I believe that should now
Okay,
be
great.
visible. Is that correct? Fantastic. All right, so everybody, thank you again for allowing us to take some of your time this afternoon to give you some of the highlights from what is only actually the second annual report that has been completed since the GSP was submitted to DWR. So this is going to be due now April 1st of every year. Moving forward, it will cover the water year again, which is going to range from October 2021 in this case, on through to the end of September in 2022. So the annual report covers a sort of a set number of topics every year to provide an update to DWR and also to board members on our status. So it's looking at the different GSP implementation activities that have been taking place in the prior year. We're also looking at the data that's been collected from our various monitoring networks. And then we're also going to be talking a little bit about some of the major metrics related to water use and water budget in the basin. And I'll also take a moment to comment that because the first annual report came very soon on the heels of submitting the GSP to DWR, this year has allowed us to sort of examine the process so that next year and moving forward, it will be more streamlined and automated wherever possible. And I want to say an extra thanks to all those who helped in aiding data collection and coordination throughout this process, especially Deborah at Mendocino County RCD, and also Beth over at Ukiah, UCRR. We very much appreciated the help. So before we get into some of the major overarching results that we want to highlight for this water year, we want to take a quick minute to remind you about what kind of conditions we were facing for water year 2022. So here you can see a snapshot from the U.S. Drought Monitor, looking at what things were like in the spring of 2022. So looking at a month of April. So you can see that we've highlighted approximately where the city of Ukiah is located there. And no longer were we in extreme drought as we were similar time the year prior, but we're still in these sort of severe drought conditions. It's still a concern. And you'll see that reflected in some of the water level that we observed at our monitoring network in the wells. So again, not as dry as the two prior years when we take a look at precipitation coming up here, but it was still quite dry. We're also going to see that reflected in the sort of volume of water that was observed at Lake Mendocino. So here you can see a snapshot graph that I pulled from the DWR website. We have a time period on the x-axis ranging from about July 2014 on through, when did I do? About October 2022. So you can get a longer term sense for what fluctuations have looked like in terms of volume. On the y-axis, we have volume in acre feet. And what you'll notice with this red arrow indicating here is a pretty historic low. So only one other time, I believe in the 1970s, was Lake Mendocino volume lower. And so just want to keep this in mind as we're thinking about what else is happening in the basin. So still very dry conditions. So here for you as well as a look at one of the NOAA precipitation stations that we look to as we're completing the annual report. So this histogram again has time on the x-axis. We have annual precipitation totals, excuse me, given in inches on the y-axis. And you'll see that also with the dashed line, we have a long-term average and then a rolling 10-year mean. So we can see that water years 2020 and 2021 were quite low as we look at this historic record dating back to the 1960s or so. And 2022, well, I said, it was better, we're still looking quite low and certainly well below that long-term average in and around 35 inches or so compared to about 46 for our long-term average. So again, things are still looking pretty dry in the Ukiah Valley Basin. So I just want to take a quick moment as well to remind us about some of the sustainable management criteria or metrics that we use to check in on the sustainability of the basin. These are identified in the GSP and all of the details can be found there. We're going to give a quick overview of the first four here. Thankfully, subsidence is not a major issue for Ukiah Valley Basin. And again, very minimal changes this year. So we're going to go ahead and pass that one over. So again, I'm going to walk you through these different metrics and check in, see how the Ukiah Valley Basin is looking. So for groundwater elevation, we have established in the GSP a monitoring network, a series of wells that are screened in both Aquifer 1, which is the more shallow aquifer, and Aquifer 2. a deeper portion of the aquifer. Again, these have communication between them and also, of course, communication with surface water. So there is not a major aquiclude or aquitard separating these two portions of the upper and lower aquifer. So we have 7 representative monitoring points. These are the ones against which we'll kind of check in and measure against some of our sustainable management criteria, which I'll talk about in the next slide. 4 of those wells are screened in aquifer 1 and 3 are in aquifer 2. So you can see the panel on the left side of the screen is going to indicate in bright green those that are part of the representative monitoring network we're going to focus on today. The others are also important, and I'll talk about how they give us more information a little later on too. One thing to note is that we discovered while completing the annual report that one of the designated RMPs that we had identified in the GSP appears to have actually been destroyed during a construction project. So we found notes from DWR to this effect, and the GSA is working to explore alternatives that might be utilized moving forward, sort of screened at a similar level and in a similar geographic location. So we do not have updated information for this particular well for water year 2022. So as I mentioned, there are also some non-RMP sites. Those are designated in purple on these 2 maps. And one thing I want to note is, although we're going to report on about 14 of them in this report, this is in flux. We've added several new wells that I'll talk about, and we wanted to build up enough data points in order to include them in future reports. So these, if you go ahead and want to actually look through the annual report, these are featured in the one of the appendices in the report. And again, I'll talk about how else they're used as we're completing the annual report. So I mentioned this idea of the sustainable management criteria. Important among those are groundwater elevation. And we compare the groundwater elevation at our representative monitoring points against 3 different sort of sustainability indicators that are designated in the GSP. The first of those is a sort of a non-regulatory indicator called a trigger level that helps us to examine what conditions look like relative to what we hope to see after the wet season recharges the groundwater basin. We know that Ukiah is very responsive to seasonal inputs from precipitation. So we want to see, has the precipitation been sufficient to bring us back to where we hope to be for the coming year? We also have the measurable objective. So when we see groundwater elevations above this MO or measurable objective, we feel that we are on track to achieve sustainability in the next couple of decades, as laid out in the GSP. We do not hopefully want to be dipping below or approaching the level of minimum threshold. So again, if we get too close to this or we're dipping below, we want to take notice that perhaps we need to examine some of the mechanisms driving lower groundwater elevations and maybe some actions that need to be taken to ensure groundwater elevations do not seasonally dip lower. So one thing that I do want to emphasize here and that we'll be thinking about as we look at water level trends at some of our important RMPs is the fact that sort of a transient dip near the minimum, minimum threshold or below the minimum threshold is in itself not considered a condition of non-compliance. And so as laid out in the GSP, we actually, in order to really start moving towards a non-compliant condition, need to have 1/3 of the RMPs, we currently have 7 stations, falling below their respective minimum thresholds for 2 consecutive years. So again, what I'm going to present today is not a representation that we're in non-compliance, but something we probably want to start taking notice of. Okay, before I go into a few of the detailed, what we call hydrographs, representing conditions over time of well elevation at our target sites, I want to give you a snapshot of what things looked like for fall 2022, so just this past fall. And the colors indicated on the map here are going to be, so if we're looking at green, we are at or above that measurable objective. Things are looking good and on track for sustainability in the next 20 or so years. If we're getting into a yellow zone, that's a condition where elevation is between the measurable objective and the minimum threshold. So not not a flag, but interesting to observe that we have dipped a bit below our MO. And then red is indicating that we are at or below that minimum threshold, where we really want to take notice and maybe start to ask what's going on and driving some of the fluctuations that we observe at this particular site. So you will see that I have represented here 6 of the RMP sites. Again, one of them has been destroyed. We need to find a replacement. And you'll notice that for those areas that are sort of in the northern portion of the basin, north of the city of Ukiah, we do have some flags where we're seeing either conditions approaching the MT or actually at or below the MT. For the lower portion of the basin, we saw that fall conditions are looking pretty good. So we're going to take a moment to look in more detail at the trends over time at the 2 sites where we saw perhaps some concern, some fluctuations at the end of the dry season that we're getting close to the MT. All right, and again, this is not an undesirable result as of now, but we want to explore the causes. One thing I want to note is that the monthly measurements that Deborah Edelman has been providing have been incredibly helpful in looking at more complete picture of annual fluctuation in elevation at the wells. So we're going to see, as we take a closer look at a couple of these sites, pretty pronounced seasonal lows, particularly in the kind of Redwood Valley area and near Lake Mendocino. So I'll talk a bit more about that and what we discuss at the TAC in the next slide. And so I put in a red arrow to indicate sort of circa the October 2022 measurement, so it can sort of help to situate you in time as we're looking at these patterns. All right, so here is one of our, again, representative monitoring point sites screened to Aquifer 1, located not too far from Lake Mendocino. And what you notice here is that we did have a couple of months in the end of 2022 where we did deviate below the minimum threshold. This was a really interesting point of discussion during our TAC meeting a couple of weeks ago. And Deborah Edelman did point out that perhaps some pumping from a well that has not been pumped in quite some time nearby could possibly be influencing some of this drawdown. We also saw that Lake Mendocino was at record low. So this is something that we are continuing to work with the GSA to explore and try to understand some of the combined mechanisms that are producing this type of pattern. And again, once we get some more funding, hopefully from an implementation grant, we can update the model and run some other scenarios that might also be instructive. Finally, we are discussing the possibility of installing a continuous monitor for water level at this location so that we can more closely track what's going on. Okay, so here is another of the locations where, again, we saw some deviation below the MO and approaching the MT. You might notice that there are 2 particularly low points here prior to this water year, and there are notes from DWR indicating that perhaps there was some pumping happening when measurements were made. Not ideal, but that's the type of data. Just want to give you a caveat with that and what we have to work with. So again, you'll notice this is in the Redwood Valley portion of the basin. And again, we have some seasonal lows that are approaching sort of the midway point between the MO and the MT. Again, something to make notice of. These are pretty shallow wells. You can see feet below ground surface on the secondary y-axis there to give you some sense of that. Okay. And again, we're just looking at a zoomed in version of this longer term well. And then there's one more well I wanted to point out to you, again, just because we are getting to a point where we're somewhat approaching the MT, but we saw some good recovery for the fall at this location. But again, sort of that late summer, we were approaching the MT. We saw that for sort of 2 years, getting a bit close. So this is a subset of our RMPs. We appreciate Chair McGordy emailing and asking, and being interested in what some of the trends look like. I've saved the other hydrographs for the end, should we have time and interest to explore those a little bit more. But these are the ones that we really wanted to emphasize. All right, so just to quickly touch upon the fact that the GSA has been active in trying to improve and expand its network, especially in consideration of the 5-year update that's coming in 2027, so that perhaps we can add more representative monitoring points, and also have updated SMCs if needed. And so this is also helping us, these additional wells that DWR has installed and the GSA has installed with continuous monitors will also help us, again, to get a better handle on seasonal fluctuations and perhaps the impact that this has on interconnected surface waters, which we know is a very crucial theme and area of interest in the GSP and for DWR. All right. The other thing that I wanted to mention with these non-RMP sites is that these help to inform some of the other SMCs. They go into calculations of groundwater storage estimates and also help us to generate groundwater elevation contours, all of which go into the annual report, which you will see if you are able to take a look. There's thought also that some of these sites may become future RMP sites as we're able to establish longer data trends for these locations. So they still serve a very important role. All right, so we're going to take, again, a very quick look at groundwater storage and groundwater quality before moving on to our last sort of area of interest, SMC. So groundwater storage, it appears in 2021 that water year did increase. Now, this is an estimate that's based upon water level in our monitoring network, but running the hydrologic model really does give us a better estimate. So as we're able to have more funding and run the model in the future, we'll have a more solid estimate for the actual magnitude of the changes that we observe on the year-to-year basis. Another update with water quality, it has remained good in the basin. All nitrate and specific conductivity measurements were below thresholds. Only one sample taken in October 2021 was slightly elevated on the order of about maybe 10%, 5% above the threshold for manganese. And so this is a site that is historically elevated, and it appears to be coming from natural geologic sources. All right, so finally, we'll talk about interconnected surface waters. So as of now, we have a monitoring network that includes stream gauges and wells. And for the first 5 years of GSP implementation, it was determined that we'll really focus on applying SMCs and examining conditions at just a subset of these locations. So we've identified 3 wells that are also part of the groundwater elevation network and have established SMCs to check and see what the conditions look like and sort of what possible consequences might be for, again, adjacent interconnected surface waters. And all of these are screened to Aquifer 1. So to give a quick summary, in looking at spring measurements and fall measurements, again, spring is when we make a comparison against the trigger, that non-regulatory standard that gives us a sense for how we're doing. Every single site was below the trigger. We are coming off of historically low precipitation. So in some ways that's not surprising, but we are seeing the basin is not recharging to the extent we hope it will after the wet season for this past year. For fall measurements, again, we have one location, that one that was near Lake Mendocino, that is below the minimum threshold for the fall measurement. The other 2 had recovered and were at least above the measurable objective. So again, these are areas of interest where we may want to interrogate some of the mechanisms that are taking place to cause some of these lower levels, and perhaps want to consider management actions that can help ensure that we move towards sustainability in the future, especially for some of those interconnected surface waters. All right, so again, we have plans, and it was part of the implementation grant. We drew up a plan for a study to examine interconnected surface waters, characterize them more thoroughly, and also expand the monitoring network. So if we don't get that funding, we hope that we can pursue other funding that will allow us to complete this investigation. And we hope that for the 2027 5-year GSP update, again, we'll be able to re-examine some of the SMCs and have, at that point, better characterization, of the conditions in the basin. All right, so I will pause there in the interest of time. I do have a couple of updates regarding our continuous monitoring wells in response to the recent storms, but I will pause here in case there are questions or we do not have sufficient time because I have covered everything that I wanted to get to for the annual report. Eric, you can let me know how things are looking, or Chairman McGordy, if you would like to proceed.
So we started a little bit late, given that we normally would have, what, an hour and a half for a meeting? Does anybody object to going a few minutes over? Since we're all here.
Just to let you know, I have to leave it by 3:30 to pick my daughter up from school.
Okay, no problem. We should be finished before then. Director Crane.
Could you refresh our memories on the distinction between Aquifer 1 and 2?
Sure, and maybe Laura can also speak to this more competently since she was there during GSP development, but I believe it's sort of just a hydrogeological, sort of the geological characteristics of the two basins is slightly different at those different depths, but there is not a considerable physical boundary between the two. And Laura, maybe you can speak to that more.
Yeah, so basically the Aquifer 1 was created and designed in the hydrogeological conceptual model, really to look into the alluvium deposit around the river. So it's really, the Aquifer 1 has a weird shape and really follows the shape of the rivers and the tributaries. And Aquifer 2 is a little bit the deeper aquifer. So we know that we discussed a lot about what's the connection between the two. So what's the connection between Aquifer 1 and Aquifer 2? Because like Audra said, it's not that there is a clear impermeable barrier. So there is communication between the two aquifers. And that was part of what we suggested to do in the implementation grants in the future. So really trying to figure out not only the impact on interconnected surface water from the very shallow, but also how the deep aquifer can eventually impact the shallow aquifer.
Other questions from board members?
Respective boundaries?
You want the boundaries? I can find the map from the GSP. You can keep going and then I'll get back to you. I just need to open the file.
That sounds great. Well, Laura's looking into that. If there is interest, we can take a quick look at some of the response at two of our continuous monitoring wells to the recent atmospheric rivers. Okay, great. And so again, what I'm going to show you is preliminary data. And so please keep that in mind. And then we're comparing it against precipitation from the NOAA station that I referenced earlier in the presentation. So the time span that we looked at was from the beginning of October 2022 on through the beginning of February. So we've certainly had more storms in the intervening time, but this is the time period we're going to cover. Okay, so we're looking at water level at these two locations. So these are wells installed by the GSA with continuous monitors. So this first location, you can see here, we can see with the dashed darker blue line that's representing precipitation inputs in inches at that NOAA station. And then we have the depth to water indicated on the primary y-axis and with that lighter blue line. And again, we have that time span on the axis from about October to the beginning of February. So you'll see that we have pretty impressive responsiveness at this location to precipitation inputs to the basin. So Laura can describe this too in comparison to some of the other basins that LWA works in, but this was a very considerable amount of recharge to observe in quite a short period of time. So it's interesting. So we know Ukiah is very sensitive. Here we can also see similar setup with precipitation and depth of water. This was just an instrumentation issue. This is not a true indication here that we had a huge drop in water level. Again, this is just preliminary. But again, you see that there is quite a response in the groundwater elevation to precipitation inputs also at this location. And so again, this shows how responsive the basin is and also the value of having these continuous elevation monitoring network, monitoring sites as part of our network in order to see some of the responsiveness and changes that we're curious about. All right. And with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And if there is any more interest in looking at some of the other detailed hydrographs or water elevation, I can certainly show that. But let me hand it back over to Laura.
Sorry, I was muted. And I just found the plot with the hydrogeological conceptual model. So Doug, basically on the left is in black is the extension of layer 1. So you see it's really pretty much around the rivers. And then in the middle is layer 2, which is a little larger. It's a different type of deposit. And there are still some areas that are the areas that are white are the areas where basically the thickness was really, really small, and it was more bedrock type of material. And then we also defined a layer 3, which is basically the bottom of the entire system, and obviously that one contains the entire Ukiah Valley Basin. So this just to give you an idea of how we did it. So layer 1 is really narrow around the river.
So Laura, are these discrete in some places? Would they be separated and not contiguous, or and possibly fed from different water sources, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how it is, Glenn, because there is no, we really never found in all the well logs any real let's say impediment to flow.
Mm-hmm.
So and we know, I think we noted it also in the GSP that some lack of data, it's really kind of preventing a full understanding of how the geology works. So we can always do better. But yeah, there was nothing really like an impermeable layer or something like that. That would make life easier, actually, you know.
And another question too. So with the water levels coming up to minus 10 feet below the surface, would those naturally drain off probably through the Russian River channel, or what do you? Well, we'll see, I guess, over time what's going to happen, but we don't get to hold on to all of that for some time, correct?
Yeah, I really, and I don't know if you remember, Glenn, at some point we did some calculation of the interaction between the aquifer and the Russian River. And during big wet years, basically the budget, if you were looking over the 12 months, was positive in the sense that the aquifer was really recharging the river.
Okay, so the river's gaining at that point from the groundwater.
Really, yeah, right now I think the river is just gaining a lot of water, and that's which is normal for the winter time. Probably this year is just more than that. I think what we need to start considering is if there are specific locations where these gain in groundwater levels are, in a sense, are capable of creating a sort of speed bump so that the water is going to the river, but it's taking a little longer to go to the river. So we would like to slow down the process of water going down to the river. So maybe there is more in the summer months. That's really the key message.
I could spend a lot of time on this because I'm keenly interested, but in the interest of time, we have to keep our meeting moving. So thank you both, Audra and Laura, for helping us on this. There's a question from Director Crane.
The elevations, allegedly in reference to sea level, how accurate are those, or how comparable are those to the sites that we were shown graphing for today?
So for the location where we have the elevation, if you noticed in the continuous measurements, we still have only depth to groundwater because we still have to go out and do the actual measurements with the GPS. But for the other wells, actually, we had measurements done with the GPS, and some they are official in the Department of Water Resources website. So you know, there can always be an error, but I'm pretty confident that those are close to be correct.
Define close.
I think probably plus or minus half a foot.
Half a foot, is that what you said?
Yeah,
Okay.
even less probably.
All right.
Depending, I would need to go back to DWR and ask which method they used back. Some of these wells are old. We would need to just check with them and
Right. I remain
confirm.
curious about Redwood Valley, which seems to be geologically quite different than our
Mhm.
Ukiah Valley. They've been lumped together by the state, but it seems like they're two different beasts.
They are.
And I wonder about, have wondered about this bathtub that we sit on top of and where its lip is for the discharge to the south, and what the profile of the elevation of the top of the water when there are no cones of depression, which is basically what the measurements are of now. What the profile of the top of the water is that may indicate what sort of flow there is to that lip that discharges the bathtub we reside over. In your work since we first discussed that principle or concern, how much more information has been developed that speaks to that?
What I think that the information that has been developed is really that with all this new data that we are groundwater levels that we are collecting right now, we are almost getting to a point where we can create it, just the surface layer that shows exactly where groundwater is with a little bit more confidence. I don't know if you remember, we did it during GSP, but with only 7 points, it was almost impossible to create a full image.
Right.
So that's one of the things that we want to look into as soon as we start working again on updating the model and working more on these interconnected surface water questions. So I think we basically, Doug, we have not really spent a lot of time looking at this question right now, but we really put a lot of effort in collecting the information that we need to answer questions like the one that you have.
It's something you've spoken of before,
Mm-hmm.
is some monitoring beyond some of these wells so that we can understand better what the cones of depression are like, which would be helpful for us in actually determining the total amount of water that may be harvestable.
Yeah, and that's why actually Deborah is already right now collecting 24 data from 24 wells, and we installed 8 continuous monitoring points. So the continuous one are really useful, and we have in the plan we were looking into other a few more continuous wells. So it's all coming together and it's going exactly in that direction. At the end of the day, I hope that all these new points will tell us a story about this change in the flow direction between winter and summer, when in the winter you have the aquifer recharging the river. In the summer, you have the river losing water into the aquifer, but it would be better to have a more refined pictures to fully understand where and when, what is happening. I think also what we found out about the well near Lake Mendocino that went down so much, I think it's very interesting from our perspective. We will have to really explore what's going on there. And I agree with you, Doug, that it has been classified as a single basin, but the upper part and the lower part, they are very different. And they behave very differently.
In the interest of time, this is a really great
Sure,
discussion.
sorry. sorry, Glenn.
I know.
I can keep going.
I know we get scientists going, they really start to riff on it, and I appreciate it because I'm really deeply interested in this too, and long-term, we have a lot to discover, and we want to be able to be sure that we can accurately describe our hydrology so that people to the south of us don't think that we're taking their water or something crazy like that. So I appreciate the science at this point, and I will, wondering if someone would like to move the recommended action, which is adopt the water year 2022 annual report.
So moved.
Seconded.
Okay, so it's been moved and seconded. Moved by Director Crane and seconded by Director Gasca. Let's call for the question.
Director Gasca?
Aye.
Director McNearland?
Aye.
Director White?
Aye.
Director Crane?
Aye.
Chair McGorty?
Aye. Motion carries.
Chairman Jaguari, I have a suggestion to move to agenda item 6 and then resume the ordering for starting at 5F afterward, in the interest for Director McNearland in her time constraint.
Right, so item 6 is consent items. Does anybody want to pull anything for consideration or other discussion?
Move approval.
Second.
Okay, been moved and approved to accept the consent agenda. Roll call vote, please.
Director Gasca?
Aye.
Director McNearland?
Aye.
Director White?
Aye.
Director Crane?
Aye.
Chair McGorty?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Carries. Item F, stakeholder project updates. Are there any?
Chair McGorty, I would like to ask Laurel Marcus from the California Land Stewardship Institute to provide a stakeholder update on a recent grant that was received by CLSI and the City of Ukiah for a drought resiliency grant.
Hi, everyone. I actually have two grants that are related to the GSA. The first one you'll remember, as I've been on the been at meetings before and described it to you before you sent us a support letter. It was from the Department of Conservation, and we recently prepared an overview of recharge sites that we sent to all of you. We have since then also completed an overview of locations in the valley where we can do riparian revegetation work, and we will be sending that for your comments. And most recently, we've just finished one on fire and fuel load reduction, which has a lot to do with actually how much water runs off. So we'll be sending all of those to you for your review.
Cannot hear her.
Laurel, we cannot hear you. You went on, the audio cut out for some reason.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I have no idea why. Anyway, I'll start all over. The most recent grant, which was approved, I think in January, is from the Bureau of Reclamation, and it is a drought resiliency grant. And we did this in partnership, the proposal in partnership with the city of Ukiah, as the city is putting up most of the matching funds. The city, when it was curtailed from using its surface water supply and had to use all groundwater, had some times when if anything had broken at all, it would have not been able to provide adequate water to all of its customers. So they need an additional well during times when they can't use surface water in order to make sure they can give water to everybody. So this grant will partially fund the well, and then the city, as paying for its part of the well, provides the matching funds for the grant. The other part of it is to create an extension of model that Flora and her folks developed, and specifically look at the effects of pumping wells at different rates in different locations in the valley on flows in the river. We'll be doing a survey of the river channel in order to connect those things together. And then we have a group of growers that wrote support letters who are interested in being part of this. And they will give us an idea of the pumping rates that they use for their different areas. And this would be most likely focusing on summertime water use. So pumping for irrigation rather than safe process control. There will be a technical group that will pull from probably the TAC for this group, as well as the water sharing program, as well as a few other technical experts that we want to include. And once we get the modeling done, most of the input from others really is on the scenarios that we model in locations. We will be preparing a display, internet interface display, so people can go on to a website and they can see a lot of information that will help them make decisions about what water supply to use. So should they use groundwater? Should they be using their surface water rights? Should they be using their contract water rights? And a lot about water conservation and a number of others. So the idea is to make a lot of the data that we're already collecting easier for the average farmer to look at. Homeowners would also, I imagine, be able to look at this, but it won't have the same, as much information for them. We also have the ability to install 4 gauges into monitoring groundwater, so more continuous groundwater monitoring. And in the presentation that Larry Walker Associates gave, there was one well that had a drop in it, but we don't know if that's because there's a well nearby that's pumping, or if they're pumping the well, or what was going on. So that's, for example, one of the candidate wells that we would put in a continuous monitoring gauge, because then you can really tell what's going on. And you know, we'll talk more with you about the other locations, and of course with Laura and such. And then the grant will end in 3 years. The maintenance of the gauges will probably fall to the GSA. So that's sort of a quick review. Anybody else?
Any question from our members? Well, I think that's great. Again, trying to have more precision about the effect of our well irrigation on the river is critical in so many ways. And I appreciate the science that you're putting into this project. It's going to be really enlightening, I'm sure, for us.
Yeah, you know, Glenn, if you have any technical experts that might sit on a panel for free because we don't have money to pay them, let me know, because this could be, there's lots of research that comes out of these kinds of things.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind. All right, thank you, Laurel.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other stakeholder online? Okay. Kind of looking for hands in our electronic world. Online, is there any other stakeholder reports at this time? Nope. Okay. Well, that will take care of that item. And then item G is compliance process with Executive Order N323, formerly N722.
So briefly, just a really quick overview. The executive order came out N722 in March of last year, and since then the governor issued a new executive order in February, N323, and it only added one additional clarifying language around a well that will be placed on a property that's related to eminent domain or condemnation scenario. So it doesn't really significantly change the executive order compliance process that we are concerned about. And a really quick update on the compliance process. Our legal counsel and myself are working with the county to try to work towards a solution for having a process that the GSA and the county are comfortable with proceeding with. One of the challenges with complying with this executive order is that traditionally county staff don't have technical experts on groundwater to facilitate this type of compliance, and typically it's a health perspective that's mostly what they're focused on. So it proves a challenge, and our GSA is not alone in this. Every GSA I've talked to, every other manager I've talked to, they're all facing the same issues. So we're proactively working towards this right now, and we're hoping to work more with the county and to come up with a process that will be good for everyone. And we will be having a a second workshop to share the revised process that we have in mind based on the feedback we received from the November workshop. We'll be having our next workshop on April 17th at the Barra Mendocino Winery. And we're inviting stakeholders from the agricultural community and everyone else from the public to attend that, so that way we can further discuss and talk about the updates that we're proposing and getting more feedback. So that will then inform the final process that we eventually land on over time. And we're hoping to work towards that by the end of the fiscal year, but it all depends on the timing and the process of which we're working within right now with the county. So that's the current update right now on this. And if you want further details, please refer to your board packet on this agenda item.
Okay, any questions from board members before we leave this item? All right. So we'll move to item H, grant funding opportunities.
So on this particular item, as mentioned before earlier at the beginning of the meeting, there's a couple grant opportunities that we researched. One of them in particular, which is the first one in that table, which I'll pull up in a moment here on my screen to share with everyone. But this particular opportunity from the California Office of Planning and Research is the one that I'm currently looking into right now to see if there is an opportunity to use this grant to fund our future grants. So it's grant funding that possibly could be eligible to be used to then go after additional funding in the future. And so that way we alleviate our budget to pursue grant funds from other entities. So I should have some more clarity on that in the future. And if that proves to be a possible option, it seems like this could be a really good opportunity for the GSA to put in up to $10,000 to pursue this grant. And if awarded this grant, we can then use that money to pursue other grants and to develop a funding plan around that. And then that way we can have future grant opportunities we want to pursue be funded by this grant. We're still clarifying if that's actually the real language that they're proposing that we read through. And if that does become a possibility, I will then confer with the chair and the vice chair and the grant ad hoc committee to get some direction and pursue this if needed.
Okay, so we don't need to take any action on this, you'll come back to us with the information.
Yeah, so the deadline is at the end of the month, so it's also got a really tight turnaround. And so with that, I believe that if it proves to be true, then I can then confer with the chair and vice chair to then decide, is this worth our time on this short timeline? Can we do this? And then if needed, we can move with that action, and we can determine if a special meeting is needed to do that, or if there's another option to get approval to move forward on that.
That sounds good. Any questions from board members?
That is the recommended action.
That would be our recommended action then, is to
I move
direct.
the recommended action.
Second.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded for a recommended action on this. We're ready for a vote.
Director Gasca?
Aye.
Director McNearland?
Aye.
Director White?
Aye.
Director Crane?
Aye.
Chair McGordy?
Aye.
And carries.
Okay, so then on to item 7, which is director reports. Are there any director reports? Okay. Item 8 is comments and updates from Department of Water Resources Representative.
Dominic left a message in the chat that he had to log off at 3 o'clock, but he encourages anyone, if you have any questions from DWR, you can reach out to him directly. And I would also be happy to facilitate that if needed.
Okay. Future agenda items.
Future agenda items will include the fiscal year 2024 budget and approving that and having a further discussion on that. It will also include an update on the compliance of the executive order and where we are at in that process, and if we have anything more concrete to bring to the board to approve. And it'll also include an update from our grant pursuits, if we have any updates, especially related to the DWR grant. And then it'll also include touching on some other housekeeping items for the GSA and its function. And it will also lastly include further discussion on procurement and our plan for moving forward in fiscal year 2024 and beyond with consultants, one of them being the written fee study consultant that will be brought to the board for recommendation and approved to move forward on that contract. We had interviews yesterday. We're currently conferring a little bit more, and we'll be providing a recommendation to the board at the next board meeting.
Okay, well, that sounds like a pretty full meeting as well. So we'll look forward to that. And with no further business, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.
Woo.